for the conflict professionals, it's not a requirement to do any mindfulness practices, but to have that foundation of stillness or just something to come back to, something that kind of like levels your emotional states, like meditation can be very helpful. Just to do that, to have that kind of base of, for example, daily sitting, or it can also be a physical practice, but to really have something to work with the emotions that come up and to work with the internal side. That is, in my opinion, is very helpful. If you do get a little or practice it a little and have a little self-awareness, you can feel it within yourself, like when you do feel the anger arising when it's arising and not after the situation, so you can learn to really feel these bodily sensations. And that is, I think that is can be a very helpful point. Like, for example, in a conversation, you just feel like, oh, my chest is getting very tight. And after a while, you also become very familiar with many of the bodily sensations you might be having.
The Center for Understanding in Conflict welcomes you to The Other Chair, a monthly podcast exploring the dynamics of conflict and how to bring the human issues to the table. Together with our guests, we explore how the power of understanding each other can lead to better solutions for people on both sides of an issue. We will also share tips for managing your own mediation practice, approaching conflict in the professional world, and ways to apply our understanding-based model in your personal life. Hello to our listeners, and welcome to The Other Chair. My name is James Dykman. Today's guest is David Dörken, a lawyer, Zen Buddhist practitioner, and mediation teacher based in Leipzig, Germany. David brings a unique perspective to conflict resolution, blending his legal expertise with mindfulness practices inspired by Zen principles. His work emphasizes openness, presence, and non-judgmental understanding as essential tools for transforming conflict into meaningful connection and growth. With experience spanning legal counsel, mediation, and teaching, David helps individuals and organizations approach disputes with clarity, compassion, and creativity. Hello, David, and welcome to The Other Chair.
Hi, James. Thanks for inviting me.
Great to have you here today. I appreciate you making the time. We do have mindfulness practice that runs through our teaching here at the center, and it would be great if we could start. Maybe you could explain a little bit more about where your legal experience and your Zen practice overlap and how that informs your conflict resolution work.
Yeah, thank you, James, and thanks for the introduction. And yeah, I mean, I've been doing legal work for quite some time, and also meditation and Zen practice for now a long time. And for a long time, it didn't seem to overlap, but yeah, I did by meeting Gary Friedman in 2019. There was a very clear overlap finding mediation for me and working with people in conflict. And there's definitely an overlap I could see from the very beginning in finding mediation.
And how did you come into that work, both your Zen practice, but then also your mediation work? Was it in which one came first, and at what point did you bring one into the other?
The Zen practice was first, and there was coincidence, I could say. My parents are very good friends with my Zen teacher, Zentatsu Beiko Roshi, and so I knew him as a child growing up. And then, yeah, just at some point, I think I was still in school, I became very interested in Zen practice and what he's doing. So I started practicing Zen, and yeah, mediation came up much later, and actually through Zentatsu Beiko Roshi, because he's a very close friend of Gary Friedman, and that was in 2019. And I actually participated in a seminar called Mediation and Meditation with Gary and Richard Beiko Roshi in 2019. So that was, for me, that was kind of the start.
And how do these mindfulness practices support mediators in remaining grounded and present?
The daily meditation, the centering for me that comes through sitting on a regular basis really gives me the opportunity to stay within myself, to stay grounded, to stay present, to see my reactions before reacting them out, or to see what comes up. And it does, I suppose, it does give me a certain calmness or groundedness also within conflict that I can oftentimes I can feel and come back to.
And does this role of stillness help participants or those in the mediation room feel seen and heard? And how does that practice help those who are mediating to be mindful of that, in your experience, from your perspective?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's an interesting question. So for me, the stillness does help to, I mean, it also took me some time, but the stillness, I would say, does help me to engage with people and kind of be more in tune with what's really happening. So every now and then, for example, one thing I use in mediation a lot, or in conflict situations, is also to kind of like slow down, come back to myself, feel what's going on, and then from that point to really try to listen or really engage with the other person. And that just that notion of slowing down, of coming back to myself for a moment, kind of getting back to a moment of stillness, that really helps me. And it does help me to see my own, I mean, in the best case, see my own reaction. And from that point, kind of from a more clear perspective, to be in tune or engage with the other person and really understand what's going on. So that I would say is the stillness part that really helped me.
Talk a little bit more about the role of non-judgmental awareness in your Zen practice, and then how that shows up in your mediation and conflict resolution work.
For me, coming into a situation and basically into a conflict situation, and things are coming up, and the situation might get louder. And for me, I mean, I can't say every time, but for me, every now and then it does help kind of like bring my attention back. And as I just said, to really observe what's going on first inside of me, but then also to kind of like almost like emptying the inner container, and to really relate to the situation and try to act accordingly. And for me, that is a huge benefit, or a huge, huge help or helping factor that can come from meditation practice. So what you just said with non-judgmental awareness, for me, the way I use it, or the way just very personally in conflict situations, is kind of like emptying myself and really to try to see the situation anew. That for me is so helpful in so many situations. It's not just mediation, but so many situations in which you don't come with your like kind of a conceptual approach, that you're saying, okay, there's a conflict, and when there's a conflict, I have 1, 2, 3, but you just go in there, and it's more like it's almost like a bodily experience, and emptying yourself in kind of a bodily experience for me. And that's really something that Zen practice and my teacher, Sentetsu Baker Roshi, and the practice I learned really helps me in that regard.
Is this process of emptying the container to prepare yourself something that happens at the beginning of a mediation session, or is it something that's ongoing throughout?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for me, basically, I would say the basis is kind of the stillness practice that I that I do on a regular basis. So for me, it does require the kind of like ground or basic stillness, that I feel oftentimes some kind of clarity in the best case. But then it's also right in the situation. I feel like I can come back to, for example, bodily sensation, and do try to do a certain kind of emptying also in the conflict situation itself. But for me, the basis comes from sitting still.
Conflict manifests itself in many ways in our personal lives, for professionals in the workplace and for practitioners who have made a career bringing together parties in conflict through mediation practice. Each month, the Center for Understanding in Conflict hosts live webinars with featured guests discussing best practices and sharing their experiences for tackling conflict using the understanding-based model. Does your experience, your legal experience and your Zen practice experience jockey for position or take priority in certain measures during a mediation? How do you balance your legal experience and your Zen practice to the benefit of those you're attempting to help?
Well, for me, it's not so much an either or different. At this point, it doesn't feel so much like different fields I'm coming from or working from. It's more, I would say it's more like an intuitive choice of what's needed at the moment. And when there's like a legal concern, I would respond more from a legal perspective, which is more from a borrowed knowledge, like just information that I know or might not know. So it's more like I would say it's more like an intuitive approach. And yeah, and I also can say that in a certain moment I use something that I learned in mindfulness practice or not. It's more coming intuitively after a certain point for me.
I'm sure that, or I would assume that those you're working with are aware of your legal background, but do you have a conversation about your mindfulness practice, or is that just something that you have operating internally while you're working with people?
So most of the time, or in the past, I would say, in the past I had it operating internally, but now more and more I'm sharing it. I talk about it, or people ask me questions about it. I do see also a change in perspective, I would say, during the past 10 years or so. Like 10 years ago, mindfulness practices or Zen meditation wasn't that as well known as it's now. So I did see kind of a change, and now it's more like a common thing to do yoga or meditation and to include that. So people get more and more interested and ask questions about it and pretty open to share. And so I also include it and make it explicit.
So let's talk a little bit more about the understanding based model, which is, of course, the centrist approach to conflict resolution and mediation, though there are many. What is your approach in supporting parties to take responsibility for their own conflict and solutions? And is there a thread from that that also shows up in your mindfulness work as you center yourself in the moment?
One thing I would say that for me from the very beginning was a very, very interesting overlapping. And it's also the approach Gary Friedman developed, I suppose, is the notion of holding space and basically letting whatever comes up, letting arise whatever comes up. And for me, the way I learned the mediation is basically so there's for example the concept, the idea of letting the parties own the conflict. And for me as a mediator, it's very interesting to just basically nurture the space and nurture the possibility for the parties to come together, for example, through listening, through holding the space, through being there, but not so much making decisions on my own or giving advice or any of that. And that for me is very similar to meditation. What I experience in meditation. So it's basically finding the the right circumstances or just building the space, but then so you sit down in meditation and then whatever comes up and you can't control it. But you can kind of like navigate or work with it. And that for me is it's very similar. And it's something I particularly in the understanding based model I really appreciate.
So you're trained to be aware, both through the understanding based approach, but then also presumably through your mindfulness, your Zen practice, to be aware when emotions come up. How do you prepare those who are in conflict, who you're working with, to do the same, to be aware when those emotions start to come up that could make the process more difficult or derail it altogether?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's difficult even if you're trained or like trained, I don't know, but even if you are kind of like used to observe that, it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy task, and also not everybody really wants to do that. But there are a couple of things that I mean, we do have in the mediation training, we do have very, very helpful skills we develop, like we're kind of training programs, like looking at we call it inner, like basically looking at or how do you look at things that or certain things that can come up, like judgments or bodily sensations. In general, I think one thing that's very helpful to do is to look at bodily sensations. We do have when we have that form of active and engaged listening and looping, we do refer back to bodily sensations. But sometimes it's also, as I said, it's just difficult to see the state you're in, or you're just reacting habitually. So that happens too. And also for me a lot. I mean, yeah, it's never perfect.
And so within that understanding the challenges, how also then do you encourage direct communication between those in conflict to deepen their mutual understanding?
Well, the main idea is to really to really support the parties to deal with the conflict and find a solution themselves. So I do make it explicit at certain points in the mediation, and I might bring it up again that really the main idea is that the parties own the conflict and are also responsible for finding a solution. And so direct communication can be very helpful. And so I kind of support parties to really have that in mind.
And do you incorporate moments where, let's say, you could have an intentional pause or slow down the conversation when emotions start to get high? Do you incorporate any reflective practices into helping participants understand how they're feeling to be able to keep them moving forward?
Yes, I mean that also depends very much on participants, and some are more open for reflective practices than others. But also for myself, one thing that definitely helps me is to kind of speed down the process, to also talk a little slower at a certain point, especially when emotions get really high or the situation gets very emotional. So working with the pace can really help a lot. Having little breaks can help a lot. I also found looping people just to have that kind of like that framework you're talking in can really help the participants. But for example, reflective practices really depend on the parties.
Throughout the year, the Center for Understanding in Conflict hosts in-depth basic and advanced certificate programs designed to train you to become effective mediators and conflict resolution professionals centered in the understanding-based model. Our training programs have been the gold standard in alternative dispute resolution for 40 years and is popular within the legal community with human resource professionals, ombudsmen, and corporate workplace mediation clients. Let's talk a little bit about practical tools for conflict resolution practitioners, especially those who may be listening, who are working in many different fields where conflict presents itself. Can you talk about a little bit more in detail about the importance of inner work and self-awareness and how those who are not formally trained either through the center or in Zen practice can cultivate those skills to help support others who are in conflict?
Yeah, for me, they have a great importance just in the sense of having some self-awareness or doing some inner work, as you said. For me, it really helps to not get kind of entangled in the conflict. What can easily happen is that you don't see what comes up, or you're getting triggered or emotionally activated yourself and react differently to a party, but you don't really see that happening. And that can really alter the whole situation and also impact it negatively. So I think for that, it's really helpful to kind of get some awareness of what's going on inside yourself. And practices that helped me a lot was, I mean, as I said in the beginning, for me, sitting meditation, just sitting in stillness, no particular technique, doesn't have to be Zen or anything. You can just sit on a chair too, or however you want. And just for 10 minutes a day, just to find that moment of stillness for me really helps. You can also do it longer, but 10 minutes is very good. And the second thing I can really recommend is the practice we're having in mediation training is called the inner V, and really to look, and you can just, I mean, if you're not familiar with that particular exercise, you can just sit on a chair. Just imagine a situation you had, a conflicted situation. You can start with a very small situation, and then basically just you can start to observe your thoughts, like whatever is coming up, your judgments. For example, say, "Wow, that person is always doing this and that. I don't want that person to do that." And then you kind of like go through that. You observe your bodily experiences and your emotions, and then you can really take a look what's underneath that. For example, you might find out in the beginning there's anger, but actually there's sadness underneath. And for that, but that doesn't happen in a mediation. That is just like you can do that on your own for 10 minutes or so. And that I have to say that really helped me to get some clarity about certain situations and to not react so reactively, or to respond more with more clarity. So these two things I would say: sitting, still sitting, no particular technique, just to find that still moment in a day. And the second thing is to really learn to observe what's coming up, bodily sensations, thoughts, and then emotions and what's underneath that. And these two things I think can really help conflict professionals.
So you mentioned being mindful of not getting entangled in the conflict yourself, in some cases, not even being aware that that's already started to happen. Are there some clear signs that practitioners could be mindful of when they might be getting carried away into the conflict itself?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And it's all, I mean, the way we talk about it now, it's kind of easy, or to talk about it is kind of easy. And I mean, I say these things and it does happen to me as well. So I get totally entangled every now and then. And so it just happens. I mean, if you do get a little, or practice it a little and have a little self-awareness, you can feel it within yourself. Like when you do feel the anger arising when it's arising and not after the situation. So you can learn to really feel these bodily sensations. And that is, I think that is can be a very helpful point. Like, for example, in a conversation, you just feel like, oh, my chest is getting very tight. And after a while, you also become very familiar with many of the bodily sensations you might be having. So, for example, for me, it's really that my chest is getting tight, or I can feel it in my stomach. And then after a while, I just get reminded, okay, there's this feeling in the stomach. Okay, there's anger, there's dissatisfaction, or some kind of notion. And then it's almost like I'm setting an internal mark or something, or a note, just to say, okay, be careful, be careful, there's anger, be careful, there's sadness, or and don't react out of that necessarily. But as I said, it's a great practice for me, but it also, I think, very important. It also does happen that it's not perfect. Doesn't always work. It's sometimes you get entangled, and that's okay too. And then not to be too hard on yourself.
This podcast is supported by our CUC Connect members, whose yearly membership includes free attendance to our live monthly webinars, 12 additional featured recordings of past training events, and support from our network of certified trainers for continued professional development. Consider joining CUC Connect today and dive deeper into the understanding-based model. So I always like to ask this question of guests on our podcast, because people who work in the conflict resolution community and those who come to the center for training come from so many different walks of life. I think you have a very unique story as well, both through your Zen practice and being a lawyer. What was it that drew you to conflict resolution work? Why did you want to, dedicate, your professional life to helping those in conflict in this way? Was there a particular situation that happened in your life that drew you to this work? What's the story behind it?
Yeah, the story behind it, I would say, so I've always been interested in conflict. I studied law, and so I've been exposed to conflicts a lot. But what happened to me during doing legal practice was the personal, the emotional side of conflict is not represented, mostly is not represented in legal practice. So you're trying to find some kind of legal technical solution maybe, and the way the court system works sometimes and the way conflicts are handled can be very passive or very non-fulfilling for the parties because certain needs and certain wishes are not fulfilled in the end, and there might be a winner and a loser. So for me, also the language that is used in courts oftentimes creates more harm than there was before. And oftentimes there are not two parties leaving the court and being happy about how it went. I think this is very rarely the case. Still, I like the legal profession and everything, but this drew me to conflict resolution practices and to mediation. And when I saw Gary for the first time and his way of listening and really being engaged with people and looking at them, that deeply impressed me. And I kind of knew, okay, that's a direction I want to go in, but I didn't know what would happen or what I would be doing next.
So based on that, what advice would you have for others who are either considering becoming a conflict resolution practitioner or who are and maybe looking at how they can incorporate mindfulness practice into their work, both for their benefit and for their clients as well?
So I would say to become a conflict professional, I would support people to do the first steps. I think I personally waited a long time to do the first steps. I would encourage people to just try it out and do that and just see a center or to do some steps. And yeah, for the conflict professionals, I mean, it's not a requirement to do any mindfulness practices, but as I said, I think to have that foundation of stillness or just something to come back to, something that kind of like levels your emotional states, like meditation can be very helpful. And just to do that, to have that kind of base of, for example, daily sitting, or it can also be a physical practice, but to really have something to work with the emotions that come up and to work with the internal side. That is, in my opinion, is very helpful.
Thank you so much, David, for being here today and for sharing your insights, your work, advancing mindfulness and understanding-based approaches. I really appreciate you being here, and from Germany, no less.
Yeah, thank you very much, James. Yeah, it was great talking to you, and thanks for the invitation.
David Dörken is a lawyer, Zen Buddhist practitioner, and mediation teacher whose work continues to inspire practitioners in Germany to approach disputes with empathy, openness, and creativity. You can learn more about David on LinkedIn or by visiting Zen Lab Leipzig, ZenLableipzig.de. Thank you to today's guest for being with us today, and to our CUC Connect members whose support enables the Center for Understanding in Conflict to bring new perspectives in the field of conflict resolution and mediation to you, our listener, in each new episode. You can find out more about today's episode, along with full interviews and additional information about conflict resolution and mediation using the understanding-based model at www.understandinginconflict.org.